Welcome to Finance Empire Real Life Stories. Before we begin today's emotional journey, I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine celebrating the happiest day of your life, surrounded by friends, music, laughter, and family. And then suddenly, the one person who disappeared from your life years ago knocks on the door asking for forgiveness. What would you do? Would you forgive them? Would you close the door? Or would you finally ask all the questions that have been buried inside your heart for years? Today's story is not just about family, it is about silence, regret, broken promises, and the painful journey toward healing. It is a story about a young man named Julian who spent most of his life learning how to survive without a father, only to face him again on the night he officially became an adult. As you listen carefully, you will also improve your English vocabulary and emotional expressions connected to family relationships, disappointment, forgiveness, trust, and personal growth. So relax, listen closely, and let this real-life story take you on an unforgettable emotional journey. The music inside the apartment was loud enough to shake the picture frames on the walls. Julian's friends laughed from the living room, while colourful lights reflected across the ceiling. Someone was singing badly into a plastic microphone, while another friend tried balancing slices of pizza on paper plates. It was chaos, but it was happy chaos. Julian stood near the kitchen island smiling wider than he had smiled in months. Turning 18 felt different. It felt like crossing a bridge between childhood and adulthood. His mother Elena moved through the crowded apartment carrying drinks and snacks while pretending not to cry every time she looked at her son. For years she had dreamed about this day. 15 birthdays had passed with only the two of them. No father, no support, no explanation. Just silence. But tonight Julian refused to think about any of that. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. Then the knock came. Not loud, not confident. Soft, careful, almost nervous. Julian laughed and walked toward the door, expecting another friend to arrive late with cheap soda and another terrible birthday joke. But the moment he opened the door, every sound inside his body seemed to disappear. A man stood under the weak hallway light wearing a dark winter coat despite the warm evening air. His shoulders looked tired. His eyes looked older than the rest of his face. He held a small envelope tightly in one hand like it was the only thing keeping him standing. Julian felt frozen. Because somehow, even after 15 years, he knew exactly who the man was. "Julian," the stranger whispered softly. The voice sounded rough, damaged by time and regret. Julian couldn't breathe. Behind him the music continued, but it felt far away now, like another world. The man swallowed hard before speaking again. "I know I probably shouldn't be here." At that exact moment, a glass shattered somewhere behind Julian. He turned slightly and saw his mother standing near the kitchen doorway, staring at the man with complete horror painted across her face. Her lips trembled. "Marcus." The name escaped her mouth like a wound reopening. The stranger lowered his eyes. 15 years ago, Marcus had walked out of their lives without warning. No goodbye, no explanation. One morning, Julian had a father, and by nightfall he was gone. Now here he was standing at the door, like a ghost returning home. Julian felt anger rise inside his chest so quickly it almost frightened him. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Julian said quietly. Marcus nodded slowly, as though he deserved every hateful word waiting to hit him. "I know," he replied. Julian looked at his mother. Her face was pale and exhausted. She looked smaller somehow, as if all the years she spent being strong had suddenly returned to her body at once. "Why now?" Julian asked. Marcus looked toward the apartment full of laughter and celebration. "Because today matters," he answered. Julian laughed bitterly. "Oh, now today matters." The words hit harder than he intended, but he didn't care. Marcus accepted the pain silently. "I missed too much already," Marcus admitted. "I couldn't miss this too." Julian stepped into the hallway and partially closed the apartment door behind him. He didn't want his friends listening to this nightmare. "You already missed everything," Julian snapped. Marcus looked down at the floor. The silence between them felt enormous. Finally, Marcus reached into his pocket and slowly removed an old silver watch. The surface was scratched from years of use. "It belonged to my father," Marcus explained. "I wanted you to have it when you turned 18. Julian stared at the watch without touching it. The irony almost made him sick. A watch, a symbol of time, the one thing Marcus had stolen from him. "You think a gift changes anything?" Julian asked coldly. "No," Marcus answered immediately. "Nothing changes what I did." Julian studied the man carefully. This wasn't the powerful image of a father he used to imagine as a child. This was just a tired man carrying years of regret on his back. But regret didn't erase absence. Regret didn't teach Julian how to shave before high school graduation. Regret didn't help his mother pay rent when she worked double shifts at the hospital. Regret didn't sit beside him during lonely birthdays. Marcus held the watch tighter. "I don't expect forgiveness," he whispered. "Then why are you here?" Marcus opened his mouth slowly. "Because every year I stayed away made coming back harder." Julian shook his head in disbelief. "That's the stupidest excuse I've ever heard." Marcus nodded painfully. "You're right." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Inside the apartment, someone started singing Happy Birthday again, completely unaware that Julian's entire world had just cracked open outside the door. Finally, Elena stepped forward. "You need to leave," she told Marcus firmly. Marcus looked at her with sadness. "Elena." "No," she interrupted sharply. "You lost the right to say my name like that years ago." Julian watched his mother carefully. He had never seen this version of her before. Strong, furious, vulnerable all at once. "You left us," she continued. "You disappeared while your son cried himself to sleep, wondering why he wasn't enough for his own father." Marcus closed his eyes. The words clearly destroyed him. But Elena wasn't finished. "You don't get to walk back into our lives because you suddenly feel guilty." Marcus looked at Julian again. "I know I don't deserve another chance." Julian crossed his arms. "So what do you want?" Marcus hesitated. "One conversation." Julian stared at him for a long moment before finally stepping aside slightly. 5 minutes, he said. The kitchen suddenly felt too small for all the emotions trapped inside it. Marcus sat carefully at the table, while Julian remained standing, with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Elena stayed near the counter, watching Marcus like she expected him to disappear again at any second. Marcus rubbed his hands together nervously. "For years, I told myself I would come back when I became someone worthy of being your father," he admitted. Julian scoffed. "And how'd that work out?" Marcus gave a weak, sad smile. "Not very well." He explained how he had spent years moving between cities, working difficult labour jobs at docks and warehouses. He described sleeping in tiny apartments filled with loneliness and regret. But Julian struggled to care. Because while Marcus was finding himself, Julian had been growing up without him. "You know what's funny?" Julian suddenly said. Marcus looked up. "I used to imagine this moment all the time when I was younger." Elena lowered her eyes quietly. Julian continued. "Sometimes I imagine yelling at you. Sometimes I imagine punching you." He laughed bitterly. "Sometimes I imagine hugging you." Marcus looked heartbroken. "But eventually," Julian whispered, "I stopped imagining you at all." That sentence hurt more than shouting ever could. Marcus stared at the table silently. Julian sat down across from him for the first time. "You don't know anything about me," Julian said quietly. Marcus swallowed hard. "I know you like science." Julian looked surprised. Marcus continued carefully. "I saw your picture in a newspaper once after you won some competition." Julian blinked. "Third grade science fair," he murmured. Marcus nodded slowly. "I carried that newspaper clipping in my wallet for years." Julian felt anger and sadness twist together painfully inside him. "You watched my life from a distance," he said, "like I was some stranger." Marcus looked ashamed. "I thought staying away protected you from my failures." Julian slammed his hand lightly against the table. "No, staying away protected you." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that forces truth into the open. Marcus looked directly at his son. "You're right." Julian could feel tears threatening his eyes now, but he fought them back fiercely. "You know what the worst part is?" Julian whispered. "I spent years thinking something was wrong with me." Elena wiped tears from her cheeks quietly. Marcus looked completely shattered. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, but apologies felt small compared to 15 years. Finally, Marcus reached into his pocket again and placed a small folded paper onto the table. "My phone number," he explained. Julian stared at it. "I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight," Marcus continued. "I'm asking for the chance to earn trust slowly, if you ever decide you want that." Julian looked exhausted. Part of him wanted to throw the number away immediately. Another part of him wanted to ask a million questions. Did Marcus think about him on birthdays? Did he ever feel guilty during Christmas? Did he ever almost come back sooner? But Julian suddenly realised something important. Tonight didn't need answers for every wound. Tonight only needed honesty. "I can't pretend everything's okay," Julian said honestly. Marcus nodded. "I know. And I don't know if I'll ever see you as my father." Marcus looked down painfully. "I understand." Julian picked up the small paper slowly and folded it into his pocket. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, just possibility. Marcus stood carefully from the table. Before leaving, he looked at Julian one final time. "You became a good man without me," Marcus whispered proudly. Julian didn't know how to respond to that. Marcus moved toward the front door slowly before stopping beside Elena. "I'm sorry," he told her sincerely. Elena looked at him with years of exhaustion behind her eyes. "I hope you really mean that this time." Marcus nodded once before quietly leaving the apartment. The door closed softly behind him. And just like that, the ghost was gone again. Julian stood motionless for several seconds. Then Elena walked over and hugged him tightly. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need words anymore. Later that night, after the party ended and the apartment finally became quiet, Julian stepped onto the balcony alone. The city lights stretched endlessly across the darkness. He pulled the folded phone number from his pocket and stared at it. 15 years of anger sat inside one tiny piece of paper. He still didn't know what he would do. Maybe he would call someday. Maybe not. But for the first time in his life, the silence between him and his father no longer felt permanent. It felt unfinished. And sometimes unfinished stories still have a chance to become something meaningful. Thank you so much for listening to today's emotional journey. This story reminds us that forgiveness is not weakness, and pain does not disappear overnight. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are also carrying their own brokenness. But rebuilding trust takes time, honesty, and consistent effort. Before you leave, tell me in the comments, if you were Julian, would you give Marcus another chance? And remember, some doors reopen quietly, but they can still change an entire life. I'll see you in the next real-life story. The next morning, Julian woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight crept slowly through the curtains, casting pale golden lines across his bedroom walls. For a few peaceful seconds, he forgot everything that had happened the night before. But then he noticed the folded piece of paper sitting on his desk. Marcus's phone number. Reality rushed back into his chest like cold water. Julian sat up slowly and rubbed his face. His 18th birthday was over, but the emotional storm it created was still sitting heavily inside him. He could still hear Marcus's voice. He could still see the regret in his tired eyes. Part of Julian wanted to hate him completely. That would have been easier. But life rarely stays simple once the truth finally enters the room. From the kitchen, he heard his mother moving quietly while preparing breakfast before work. Normally, she hummed softly in the mornings. But today, the apartment felt strangely silent. Julian walked into the kitchen wearing an old grey hoodie. Elena stood near the stove making coffee, but the exhaustion on her face looked deeper than usual. "Morning," Julian said carefully. His mother turned and forced a small smile. "Morning, birthday man." Julian sat down slowly at the table. The memory of Marcus sitting there only hours earlier still lingered in the room like invisible smoke. Neither of them spoke for several awkward moments. Finally, Elena sighed heavily. "I'm sorry your birthday became so complicated." Julian shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." Elena stared into her coffee quietly. "I spent years trying to prepare myself for the possibility that he might come back someday," she admitted softly. "But when I actually saw him standing at that door, it felt like time stopped." Julian studied his mother carefully. For most of his life, she had seemed almost indestructible. She worked overtime, paid bills, fixed problems, and somehow still found energy to encourage him through every difficult moment. But now she simply looked tired, human. "Did you ever think about contacting him?" Julian asked carefully. Elena hesitated. "A few times," she admitted. "Mostly when you were younger." Julian leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you? Elena gave a weak smile filled with sadness. Because every time I almost called him, I asked myself the same question. She looked directly into Julian's eyes. If someone truly wants to stay in your life, should you have to beg them to return? Julian lowered his gaze. The words hit hard because deep down he understood exactly what she meant. After breakfast, Elena left for work, but before leaving, she placed her hand gently on Julian's shoulder. You don't owe him forgiveness, she whispered. Then she walked out the door. The apartment became quiet again. Julian spent most of the afternoon pretending to focus on cleaning leftover party decorations, but his mind kept drifting back to Marcus. Questions kept replaying inside his head. Where had Marcus slept all those years? Did he ever celebrate Julian's birthdays alone somewhere? Did he regret leaving immediately? Or only after time passed? Julian hated how curious he felt. By evening, he finally grabbed his jacket and walked outside. The city air felt cool and heavy after the previous night's emotional chaos. People moved through the sidewalks carrying groceries, talking on phones, laughing with friends. Normal life continued while Julian's thoughts remained tangled. Without fully realizing it, he found himself standing near the docks on the edge of town. Marcus had mentioned working nearby. Julian stared across the industrial buildings and shipping containers, feeling his heartbeat slowly increase. He told himself he wasn't there to forgive Marcus. He just wanted answers. That was all. At least that's what he tried convincing himself. After several minutes, he noticed a familiar figure walking out from a warehouse carrying a small toolbox. Marcus looked surprised the moment he saw Julian standing across the street. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Marcus slowly walked closer. I didn't expect to see you, he admitted quietly. Julian shoved his hands into his pockets. Neither did I. Marcus looked nervous, almost afraid that Julian might disappear if he moved too quickly. You working here now? Julian asked. Marcus nodded. Loading shipments, mostly. Julian glanced at the warehouse behind him. It looked cold, loud and exhausting. Not exactly the glamorous, successful life he once imagined his missing father might secretly be living. Marcus noticed Julian observing the building. It's honest work, Marcus said softly. Julian nodded slightly. For several moments they simply stood together, awkwardly while trucks rumbled nearby. Finally Marcus spoke again. Do you want coffee? Julian almost said no immediately, but something stopped him. 15 years ago, Marcus had disappeared before Julian ever got the chance to know him as a person. Maybe this was the first real conversation they had ever actually shared. There's a diner around the corner, Marcus added carefully. Julian hesitated before finally nodding once. The small diner smelled like burnt coffee and fried potatoes. Old music played softly from dusty speakers, while tired workers filled most of the booths. Marcus and Julian sat across from each other near the window. The awkward silence returned almost immediately. Marcus stirred sugar into his coffee, even though he hadn't taken a sip yet. You look a lot like your grandfather, he suddenly said. Julian looked up. I barely remember him. Marcus smiled faintly. He used to wake up at 5 every morning, no matter what. Said sleeping too late made life escape from you. Julian listened quietly. For the first time, Marcus wasn't speaking like a guilty stranger trying to defend himself. He sounded like a normal person remembering old memories. What was he like? Julian asked before thinking twice. Marcus looked surprised by the question. He was stubborn, Marcus answered with a small laugh. But kind. Terrible at expressing emotions, though. Julian smirked slightly. Sounds familiar. Marcus laughed softly for the first time since returning. The sound felt strange to Julian. Not bad, just unfamiliar. The waitress brought their food, and for several minutes they ate quietly. Then Julian finally asked the question that had lived inside him for years. Why did you really leave? Marcus froze. He set his fork down slowly. I was drowning, he admitted. Julian frowned slightly. Marcus stared down at the table. When you were little, I lost my job. Then debt started piling up. I felt like every day I disappointed your mother more. He swallowed hard. Eventually I started believing you'd both be better without me dragging you down. Julian listened carefully. You could have stayed and fought through it, he replied. Marcus nodded immediately. I know. The honesty in Marcus's answer caught Julian off guard. No excuses, no blaming others. Just regret. Marcus rubbed his tired eyes. The truth is, I became afraid. he admitted quietly. And fear makes people selfish. Julian looked out the diner window thoughtfully. For years he imagined his father as some heartless villain who simply abandoned his family without emotion. But sitting here now, Marcus just looked broken. Human beings were complicated, sometimes painfully so. That doesn't erase what happened, Julian said carefully. I know, Marcus answered again. The conversation continued slowly after that. Not perfectly, not emotionally dramatic. Just two strangers, carefully trying to understand the missing pieces between them. Marcus asked about school. Julian talked about college applications. Marcus admitted he always hoped Julian would have opportunities he never had. Hours passed surprisingly quickly. When they finally stepped back outside, the sky had already turned dark. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement after a light evening rain. Julian looked at Marcus differently now. Not as a father yet, but no longer entirely as a ghost either. Marcus shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Thank you for coming, he said sincerely. Julian nodded slightly. Don't make this weird. Marcus laughed softly again. I'll try. Julian turned to leave before stopping suddenly. One question, he said. Marcus waited quietly. If you could go back, would you still leave? Marcus's expression changed instantly. Pain crossed his face so deeply that Julian almost regretted asking. No, Marcus answered immediately. Not for a single second. Julian studied him carefully. For the first time in years, he believed the answer completely. That didn't fix everything. It didn't erase birthdays, empty seats, or years of silence. But maybe healing didn't begin with perfect solutions. Maybe it simply began with honesty. As Julian walked home through the cold night air, he realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't one giant moment. It was a series of tiny decisions. A conversation, a coffee, a question answered truthfully. The pain was still there, but for the first time, the future no longer felt chained completely to the past. And somewhere behind him, in a small diner near the docks, a man who spent 15 years running away was finally staying in one place, long enough to be found. Thank you so much for listening to this continuation of Julian's emotional journey. Life teaches us that broken relationships are not repaired in one conversation or one apology. Real healing takes patience, honesty, consistency, and time. And sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is return and face the damage they created. And sometimes the bravest thing another person can do is listen. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and continue improving your English through powerful real-life lessons and emotional storytelling. And tell me in the comments, do you think Julian should fully forgive Marcus someday? I'll see you in the next real-life story. Goodbye.